The galaxy had been quiet for a very long time. For over 60,000 years, the Concord of 12 had ruled the Milky Way with careful hands and slow decisions. And in all that time, nothing truly surprising had happened to any of them. Not to the cold-blooded Sithari with their ancient traditions. Not to the insectoid Kethri with their massive hive fleets. Not to the psychic Velkari who could read the emotions of entire planets. And certainly not to the Ortai, the oldest species of all, who believed they had already seen everything the universe could offer. Ambassador Kael'Veth of the Sithari Dominion sat in his elevated chair inside the Grand Assembly Hall of Helix Prime, the great rotating station that served as the capital of all known civilization. And he was bored beyond description. The session had dragged on for 6 hours already, and the delegates were arguing about asteroid mining rights in some forgotten corner of the Outer Rim. Stopped listening after the second hour, because he had heard this exact argument 400 times before in his career, and he suspected he would hear it 400 times more before he finally retired. He let his golden reptilian eyes drift across the vast circular chamber where representatives of all 12 species sat in their designated sections, each one adapted to the specific atmospheric and gravitational needs of its kind. And he thought about how strange it was that a civilization spanning an entire galaxy could be so thoroughly and completely boring. That was when the doors burst open. Watcher Admiral Thoron of the Vigilance Corps came through them at a speed that Kael'Veth had never seen from a Kethri. And the insectoid officer's forearms were trembling, and his antennae were pressed flat against his skull, which was the Kethri equivalent of screaming in terror. And every delegate in the chamber fell silent, because they had never seen a Watcher Admiral look afraid before. "Forgive the interruption," Thoron said, and his voice was shaking in a way that made Kael'Veth's scales tighten against his body. "But I bring a matter that cannot wait for procedure or protocol." He activated the central holographic display, and a waveform appeared above the assembly floor, pulsing with a rhythm that was clearly not natural, clearly not random, clearly not anything the galaxy had ever produced before. 14 hours ago, our Deep Space Monitoring Array in Quadrant 9 detected a structured signal originating from Sector 7G. The silence that followed was so absolute that Kael'Veth could hear the hum of the station's gravity generators. Sector 7G was the dead zone. Every species in the Concord knew about the dead zone the way every child knows about the dark place under their bed, and it was a vast stretch of a spiral arm that had been quarantined over 9,000 years ago after every probe sent into it had either returned with corrupted and useless data or had never returned at all, and the Concord had simply drawn a line around it on their maps and agreed to never go there and never think about it too hard. "That is impossible," said High Predictor Solvan of the Urthai from his section of the chamber, and his voice carried the weight of a species that had existed for longer than most stars. "The dead zone is empty, and it has always been empty, and our models confirm this with absolute certainty." "Your models are wrong," Thoron replied, and the fact that he said it without any diplomatic softening told Kael'Veth just how frightened the Admiral truly was. Thoron played the signal. It began with mathematics, simple and universal, prime numbers followed by geometric constants, followed by basic physical laws, the kind of mathematical language that any intelligent species would recognize as artificial. And then it shifted into something far more unsettling, grammatical structure that had clearly been built by studying the Concord's own communications, as if someone had been listening to them for a very long time and had learned their languages without ever being invited to. And then came the message itself, translated into all 12 of the Concord's official languages simultaneously. "We know you are out there, and we would like to talk." The assembly erupted into chaos. Kael'Veth watched delegates shouting over each other, and military advisors pulling up star charts, and intelligence officers whispering into secure channels. And through it all, he felt something he had not felt in decades of diplomatic service. Something that made his two hearts beat faster, and his claws extend slightly from their sheaths. He felt the electric and terrifying thrill of the unknown. Over the next 72 hours, the Concord debated and argued and threatened and pleaded, and in the end, they did what they always did when faced with something they did not understand. They formed a committee. Kael'Veth was appointed to lead the first contact delegation, partly because the Sithari were considered the most level-headed of the 12 species, and partly because no one else wanted the job, and he was given a fleet of 40 diplomatic vessels, escorted by 200 warships, under the command of Thoron himself. It was the largest military deployment the Concord had authorized in 9,000 years, and the fact that they felt it was necessary told Kael'Veth everything he needed to know about how afraid they truly were. The fleet assembled at the quarantine perimeter of Sector 7G, and Kael'Veth stood on the bridge of the flagship and stared at the invisible line on the star chart that separated everything they knew from everything they did not. "Admiral," he said to Thoron, "take us in." The fleet crossed the line, and for 3 hours they traveled through empty and silent space. Kael'Veth had almost begun to wonder if the whole thing had been some kind of cosmic mistake, some echo or glitch that had been misinterpreted as intelligence, when Thoron suddenly gripped the edge of the command console so hard that the metal bent under his claws. "Ambassador," the Admiral said, and his voice had gone very quiet, "you need to see this." The main display activated and showed the long-range sensor readout, and Kael'Veth felt his blood turn cold in his veins. There were thousands of energy signatures ahead of them, arranged in a perfect geometric formation that stretched across an area larger than most solar systems. And they were not random, and they were not natural, and they were not hiding. They were waiting. Not a fleet, a welcome party. And every single one of those signatures was burning with a power output that the Concord sensors could barely measure. Kael'Veth stood very still on the bridge of his ship and looked at the wall of light ahead of him and realized that the galaxy he had known his entire life, the quiet and boring and predictable galaxy where nothing surprising ever happened, had just ended forever. Something new was beginning, and it did not care whether the Concord was ready for it or not. The ships that waited for them were unlike anything the Concord had ever catalogued. Kael'Veth stood on the observation deck of the flagship and studied them through the magnified display, and the first thing that struck him was how different they all were from each other, as if the species that had built them could not agree on a single design philosophy, and had simply decided to build whatever they felt like building at any given moment. Some were sleek and angular, others were bulky and covered in armor plating, and a few were so strange in shape that the Concord's classification systems simply labeled them as unknown geometry and gave up trying to match them to any known engineering tradition. They were crude by Concord standards, lacking the elegant curves and energy-efficient designs that 60,000 years of shared engineering knowledge had produced. But they were enormous, some of them dwarfing even the largest Kethri hive carriers. Energy signatures so intense that the sensor officers had to recalibrate their instruments 3 times just to get accurate readings. "They are powerful," Thoron said quietly, standing beside Kael'Veth with his antenna rigid. "But they are not elegant, and I do not know which of those facts concerns me more." A single vessel detached from the formation and moved toward them, a mid-sized craft with no visible weapons, and it broadcast a docking request in perfect Concord standard language. Kael'Veth gave the order to allow it. The alien ship connected to the flagship's docking port with a mechanical clunk that vibrated through the hull, and Kael'Veth walked to the airlock with a full diplomatic escort of Sithari guards and Kethri Marines, and 2 Velkari mind-readers. He tried very hard to keep his scales from changing color, because color shifts in Sithari's skin betrayed emotion, and he did not want these strangers to know how nervous he was. Opened. 3 figures stepped through, and Kilveth had to look down to see them because they were short. Shorter than any spacefaring species he had ever encountered, and they stood on 2 legs with no tails for balance, and no claws, and no armor plating, and no visible natural weapons of any kind. The one in front was female, according to the bioscanner data flooding Kilveth's implant, and she had dark hair pulled back from a round face with brown skin, and dark eyes that moved constantly, taking in everything around her with a speed and focus that reminded Kilveth of a predator assessing a new environment. She was smiling. "Ambassador Kilveth," she said, and she said it in flawless Sithari, with the correct tongue clicks and throat harmonics that most non-Sithari species could never master. "My name is Captain Lena Vasquez of the Terran Continuity Navy, and I cannot tell you how happy we are to finally meet you face to face." Kilveth's bioscanner was feeding him data about the woman and her 2 companions, and every line of that data made his stomach clench tighter. Their homeworld was classified as a Class 12 death world. The Concorde's planetary habitability scale went from Class 1, which meant a perfect garden world with stable weather and gentle seasons, to Class 10, which meant a hellscape that no sane species would ever attempt to colonize. And anything above Class 7 was officially designated as permanently uninhabitable. These creatures came from a world with extreme axial tilt that created violent seasonal shifts, constant tectonic instability that shattered the ground beneath their feet, a weather system so chaotic that their own scientists could barely predict it, oceans that covered most of the surface and were filled with predators, and an atmosphere composed partly of oxygen, a gas so chemically reactive that the Concorde used it as an industrial corrosive. They had not just survived on this world, they had become its dominant species. "Captain Vasquez," Kilveth said, keeping his voice steady through sheer willpower. "Welcome aboard, and please know that the Concorde of 12 greets you with open hands and peaceful intentions." "Likewise," Lena said, and her smile widened, and Kilveth noticed that when humans smiled, they showed their teeth, which on every other known species was a threat display. The first formal meeting took place in the flagship's diplomatic chamber, and Lena Vasquez was extraordinary. She had brought gifts, carefully chosen to demonstrate both cultural richness and good faith, small sculptures and paintings, and a device that played what she called music, which filled the room with organized sound patterns that were strangely moving, even to non-human ears, and she presented them with a warmth and charm that put most of the delegation at ease. Most of them. Intelligence Director Morath of the Valkyrie sat at the back of the room, far end of the table, and said nothing for the entire first hour. His pale, eyeless face turned toward the humans with an expression that Kilveth could not read. And Kilveth knew that Morath was doing what Valkyrie always did when meeting new species. He was attempting a passive psychic scan. Halfway through the second hour, Morath stood up abruptly and excused himself. Kilveth found him later in a private corridor, leaning against the wall, with both hands pressed to his temples. "What did you see?" Kilveth asked. Morath was silent for a long moment. "I have scanned the minds of all 12 Concorde species," Morath said, and his voice was barely a whisper. "And every one of them has a pattern, a structure, a center, that I can find and read and understand. But these humans," he paused, and Kilveth saw that his hands were shaking. "Their minds have no center, Ambassador. They are a storm, a constant war between logic and emotion and instinct and creativity, and violence and compassion, all happening at the same time. And I could not find a single thread to hold on to before the chaos pulled me under." "Are they dangerous?" Kilveth asked. Morath lifted his head, and even without eyes his expression was unmistakable. "They are the most dangerous thing I have ever touched," he said, "because they are not one thing, they are everything, all at once, and they can become whatever they need to become in any given moment, and I have never been so afraid of anything, in my entire life. Kael'Veth returned to the diplomatic chamber, where Lena was casually mentioning that humanity had achieved faster-than-light travel, approximately 2,000 years ago. The table went silent. The fastest species in the Concord, the Kethri, had taken 11,000 years to develop FTL technology, and most species had taken even longer. And the idea that these small, soft, fragile creatures had done it in 2,000 years was not just impressive. It was terrifying in a way that none of them could fully articulate. "We are a young species," Lena said with a shrug that seemed entirely too casual for the weight of what she had just revealed. "But we are very motivated learners." She then extended an invitation for the delegation to visit humanity's home system, a place they called Sol, as a gesture of openness and trust. Kael'Veth accepted immediately. Later that night, while the fleet prepared for the journey to Sol, Thoron came to Kael'Veth's quarters with a datapad in his trembling hands. "I ran a projection model," the Admiral said, "based on their stated expansion rate over 2,000 years. And if they continue at this pace," he stopped and took a breath, "they will have filled the entire galaxy within 3,000 years. Every system, every sector, every corner, whether we are in their way or not." Kael'Veth took the datapad and looked at the numbers and felt the quiet boring galaxy he had known his entire life crack and fall away beneath him like thin ice over deep water. The fleet jumped to FTL towards Sol, and the unknown rushed up to meet them. The Sol system was not what Kael'Veth had expected. He had prepared himself for a single inhabited planet, perhaps with a few orbital stations and some scattered outposts on nearby moons, because that was the standard development pattern for most Concord species, even after thousands of years of spacefaring civilization. What he found instead made him grip the railing of the observation deck so hard that his claws left marks in the metal. The humans had not simply settled their home system. They had transformed it into something that looked like the work of a species 10 times their age. The fourth planet, a cold red desert they called Mars, was green and blue now, covered in engineered forests and artificial oceans that the humans had somehow willed into existence over the course of centuries. And the second planet, a toxic hellscape called Venus, was slowly cooling under a network of orbital sunshades so vast that they were visible from the edge of the system. And the asteroid belt between the fourth and fifth planets had been converted into a sprawling web of industrial stations and shipyards and habitats that housed hundreds of millions of people. And the moons of the massive gas giant they called Jupiter were covered in cities that glowed like jewels against the dark. 2,000 years, Kael'Veth thought, and they did all of this in 2,000 years. The delegation landed on Earth, and the humans gave them a tour that was clearly designed to be impressive, and it worked, but not in the way the humans probably intended. The cities were enormous and loud and chaotic and full of life, and the humans moved through them at a pace that made even the quick-footed Kethri Marines look slow. And there was a kind of energy to everything they did that Kael'Veth had never encountered in any other species. A restless, burning urgency, as if every human believed deep in their bones that there was never enough time, and everything had to be done right now. But the real shock came when the humans showed the delegation their history. They did not hide it. Kael'Veth had expected a carefully edited presentation designed to make humanity look noble and wise. Because that was what every Concord species did when showing themselves to outsiders. But instead the humans showed them everything, the beautiful and the terrible, in equal measure. They showed them wars that had engulfed their entire planet, not once, but twice within a single century. Conflicts so devastating that the Velkari delegates had to leave the room when the psychic echoes from the historical recordings became too intense. They showed them weapons that could split atoms and release enough energy to flatten entire cities, and they showed them the ruined landscapes where those weapons had actually been used, not in some ancient forgotten era, but within living memory of their civilization. Millions, famines that had starved entire regions, genocides carried out with industrial efficiency, ecological disasters caused by their own greed, and political systems so cruel and irrational that Kael'theth could barely comprehend how any society could survive them. And then they showed them how they had survived all of it. Every single catastrophe that would have ended any Concord species had instead made humanity stronger. Not because humans were invulnerable, but because they absolutely refused to stay down when something knocked them over. And Kael'theth watched recording after recording of humans crawling out of the ashes of their own destruction and building something new on top of the rubble, something bigger and better and more ambitious than what had come before. General Idris Okonkwo, head of the Terran Continuity Council and the most powerful human alive, met the delegation in a simple conference room with no guards and no ceremony, with gray hair and calm, steady eyes that had the look of someone who had made terrible decisions and lived with the consequences. "I want to be honest with you," Okonkwo said, and his voice was deep and quiet and carried a weight that filled the room. "Because I think honesty is more valuable than comfort, and you deserve to know exactly what you are dealing with." He leaned forward. "We are not a peaceful species," he said. "We carry violence in our blood and in our history, and in every cell of our bodies, and every generation of humans must make the conscious choice to be better than the one before. And that choice is not easy, and it is not natural, and sometimes we fail at it in spectacular and horrifying ways." He paused. "But that choice, the daily struggle to be good when it would be so much easier to be terrible, that is what makes us who we are, and I believe it is the most powerful force in the universe." The Kethri military attachés spent 3 days examining human weapons technology, and came back to Kael'theth with reports that read like horror fiction. Humans did not have a single elegant weapon system the way Concord species did. Instead, they had thousands, an endless catalog of ways to destroy things that covered every possible category, and several categories that the Concord had never even imagined. And the Kethri officers could not understand how a species could devote so much creativity and intelligence to the art of killing, while simultaneously building hospitals and schools and concert halls. They weaponized everything: kinetic energy and directed light and nuclear reactions and biological agents and chemical compounds and gravitational manipulation and digital attacks and sound waves. And the most terrifying entry in their arsenal was something they called psychological warfare, which meant they had figured out how to weaponize fear itself. But it was the art that broke the Velkari. Humans arranged an orchestral performance for the delegation, a group of about 80 humans sitting in rows with primitive acoustic instruments made of wood and metal and animal gut. And when they began to play, the Velhari delegates were hit with a psychic shockwave of pure concentrated emotion that knocked 3 of them unconscious. Human music was not just organized sound, it was weaponized empathy, capable of inducing grief and joy and rage and hope and longing in rapid succession. And the Velhari had never encountered anything in the galaxy that could affect their psychic senses so powerfully. Kael'theth sat through the entire performance and felt something stirring in his own chest that he could not name. Something ancient and forgotten that the Sithari had lost somewhere in their 60,000 years of careful civilization. On his last night on Earth, Kael'theth shared a private dinner with Lena Vasquez on a balcony overlooking a human city at night. Lights below them stretched to the horizon like a galaxy laid flat against the ground. "I need to ask you something," Kael'theth said, "and I need you to answer me honestly." "Of course," Lena said. "You knew the Concord existed for decades before you sent your signal. You had been listening to our communications and learning our languages and studying our civilizations. And in all that time you were growing stronger and spreading further into the galaxy without anyone knowing you existed." Lena nodded. "So why did you reveal yourselves?" Kael'Veth asked. "You did not need us. You did not need our technology, or our resources, or our permission. You could have continued in silence until you were so powerful that no one could ever challenge you. So why reach out?" Lena was quiet for a moment, and she looked out at the lights of her city. And when she turned back to him, her expression was different from anything he had seen on a human face before. "Sad. Because we were lonely," she said. Kael'Veth stared at her. "We looked out at the stars," she continued, "and we knew there were others out there. And the thought of growing old as a species without ever saying hello to our neighbors was more frightening to us than anything your fleet could do to us." On the journey back to Helix Prime, Kael'Veth sat alone in his quarters and thought about everything he had seen. And Marath came to him one last time with something he had been holding back. "While we were on Earth, I managed to read one coherent thought," Marath said, "from a sleeping human child." "What was it?" Kael'Veth asked. "The child was dreaming of flying between stars without a ship," Marath said, "just moving through space with arms outstretched, touching nebulae with bare hands." Marath's voice dropped to a whisper. "They do not just adapt to the universe, Ambassador. They dream of reshaping it, and everything they have ever dreamed they have eventually built. And that is why I believe they are the most important thing this galaxy has ever produced." Kael'Veth closed his eyes and felt the weight of what he would have to tell the Concord Assembly pressing down on him like gravity from a dying star. The galaxy would never be the same, and he was the one who would have to explain why. The Grand Assembly Hall of Helix Prime had never been so full, or so quiet. Every seat was occupied, and every species was represented at the highest level. Not just ambassadors and delegates, but heads of state and military commanders and intelligence chiefs, because word had spread through the Concord in the weeks since the delegation's return that something fundamental had changed in the galaxy, and everyone wanted to hear it firsthand. Kael'Veth stood at the central podium and looked out at the faces of 12 species and felt the weight of every word he was about to say. He told them everything. He told them about the ships that defied classification and the energy signatures that overwhelmed their sensors. And he told them about Captain Lena Vasquez, who spoke perfect Sithari and smiled with her teeth showing. And he told them about the death world called Earth, where the air itself was corrosive, and the ground shook, and the oceans were full of things that wanted to eat you. He told them about the wars, and the weapons, and the nuclear fire, and the genocides. And he heard the gasps and the murmurs of horror from the delegates. And then he told them about how humanity had survived every single one of those catastrophes, and come back stronger each time. He told them about the music that broke Velkari minds, and the weapons that covered categories the Concord had never imagined, and the expansion rate that would fill the galaxy in 3,000 years. And when he was finished, the assembly sat in a silence so deep that he could hear his own blood moving through his veins. Then the shouting began. The Concord fractured along lines that had been invisible for millennia, but had always been there, hidden beneath the surface of diplomatic smiles and careful consensus. And within hours, 3 distinct factions had formed, and the greatest political crisis in 9,000 years was burning through the halls of Helix Prime, like fire through dry wood. The first faction called themselves the Integrationists, led by Kael'Veth himself, along with 2 other species who shared his belief that cooperation was the only rational path forward. And they argued that humanity should be welcomed as a 13th member of the Concord, that their energy and creativity and drive could benefit everyone, and that trying to oppose a species this determined and this capable would be not just futile, but suicidal. The second faction was the Isolationists, led by Watcher Admiral Thoron and the Kethri military establishment, and they demanded that the Dead Zone quarantine be reinstated and reinforced with the largest military deployment in Concord history. And they argued that humanity should be contained within their current territory and watched carefully until the Concord could develop weapons and defenses capable of matching them, which by Thoron's own estimates would take at minimum 5,000 years. The third faction operated in shadows. High Predictor Solvan of the Urtai had said almost nothing during the public debates, and his silence made Kael'Veth uneasy because the Urtai were the oldest species in the galaxy, and they did not stay silent unless they were planning something. Kael'Veth learned what that something was 3 weeks later, when a Velkari intelligence operative named Sarath appeared at his private quarters at a late hour, with fear written across every line of her eyeless face. "You need to know what Solvan is doing," Sarath said, and she told him. Solvan had formed a secret coalition with 5 other species, and he had been running predictive models using the Urtai's legendary forecasting algorithms, simulations so complex that they took entire planetary computer networks to process, and every single simulation had reached the same conclusion. In every future where humanity was allowed to expand freely, they became the dominant species in the galaxy within 1,000 years, not through conquest or war, but through sheer momentum, because they grew faster and adapted quicker, and created more than any other species could match. And within 2,000 years, every other civilization would be living in humanity's shadow, whether they wanted to or not. Solvan's solution was simple and terrible. He was secretly assembling a coalition fleet under the cover of what he called border security exercises, pulling warships from 6 different species into a strike force of 4,000 vessels. And the plan was to launch a preemptive attack on the Sol system while diplomatic channels were still open, catching humanity off guard and destroying their homeworld and their shipyards and their infrastructure before they grew too powerful to stop. "He calls it a mercy," Sarath whispered. "He says it is better to cut out a cancer before it spreads than to let it consume the whole." Kael'Veth felt sick. Meanwhile, Lena Vasquez had taken up residence on Helix Prime as humanity's first official ambassador to the Concord, and she moved through the diplomatic halls with the same easy charm she had shown during first contact, attending functions and building relationships and learning the political landscape with a speed that impressed even the veteran diplomats. But she was not blind. She noticed the small things, the way certain delegates avoided eye contact with her, the encrypted communications that spiked whenever she entered a room, the Urthai warships that were quietly repositioning to sectors closer to the dead zone border under flimsy pretexts that no one seemed to question. She reported her concerns to General Okonkwo through a secure quantum-encrypted channel that the Concord could not intercept. "I think they are planning something," she told him. "I cannot prove it yet, but the patterns are wrong. Too many ships moving to the wrong places for the wrong reasons." Okonkwo listened, and then he was quiet for a long time. "Activate Protocol Amaranth," he said. Lena closed her eyes for a moment when she heard those words, because she knew what they meant. Protocol Amaranth was humanity's contingency plan for the scenario that every human leader had quietly feared since the moment they had decided to make contact with the galaxy. The scenario where the galaxy decided that humanity was a threat that needed to be eliminated, and it had been developed and refined and updated continuously for 2,000 years by every generation of military planners who understood that the universe does not reward trust without preparation. "Understood," Lena said, and she went back to her diplomatic functions and smiled at the delegates and complimented their clothing and asked about their families, and no one looking at her would have guessed that behind those warm brown eyes a clock had started ticking. Kael'Veth spent 3 days in agony after learning of Solvan's plot because he was trapped between 2 loyalties that could not coexist. He was a Sithari and a son of the Concord, and he had served the Assembly his entire life, and everything he had been taught told him that his duty was to his own civilization above all else. But he had also sat across a table from Lena Vasquez, and watched her show him the worst of her species' history without flinching. And he had heard Okonkwo speak about the daily choice to be good. And he had listened to human music that stirred something in his ancient reptilian heart. And he knew with absolute certainty that what Solvan was planning was not just strategically foolish, but morally wrong. On the fourth day, he made his decision. He went to Lena's quarters on Helix Prime and told her everything. Solvan's coalition, and the 4,000 warships, and the strike plan, and the timeline. Absorbed the information, and waited to see shock or fear or panic. Instead, he saw something he did not expect. She smiled. Not the warm diplomatic smile she wore in public, but something colder and harder, something that reminded him of the predators on her Death World home. And in that moment, he understood something that Morath had tried to tell him months ago. Humans were not one thing. They could be kind and they could be terrible, and they could switch between the two faster than any other species in the galaxy. "Thank you, Kael'Veth," Lena said, and her voice was calm and steady and carried no trace of surprise. "You may have just prevented the worst mistake this galaxy has ever made." She opened a secure channel to Earth and spoke 3 words. They chose poorly. And on the other end of that channel, across the vast dark distance between Helix Prime and Sol, General Idris Okonkwo heard those words and nodded once and began giving orders that would change the shape of the galaxy forever. Because the truth that the Concord had not yet learned, the truth that Solvan's perfect predictive models had somehow failed to account for, was devastatingly simple. Humanity had been preparing for this exact moment for 2,000 years. And they were ready. The Coalition fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Sol system like a hammer falling from the sky. 4,000 warships drawn from 6 species, the largest military force assembled in 9,000 years, arranged in an attack formation that the Kethri war scholars had spent weeks perfecting, bristling with weapons that could crack moons and boil oceans. All of them pointed at a small yellow star and the fragile blue world that orbited it. High Predictor Solvan stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Urtai Dreadnought Eternal Certainty, and watched the sensor displays with the calm confidence of someone who had already calculated every possible outcome, and found victory in all of them. "Begin the advance," he ordered. The fleet moved forward, and found nothing. The Sol system was empty. No defense platforms, no minefields, no orbital fortresses, no fleet of warships rising to meet them. Starlight, and the distant glow of planets going about their ancient orbits, as if nothing important was happening. Solvan's subordinates exchanged glances, but the High Predictor simply smiled, because this confirmed his models. The humans had clearly invested everything in their rapid expansion, and had neglected proper system defense. And this would be over quickly. The fleet crossed the orbit of the outermost planet and continued inward. They passed the gas giants and their glittering moon cities and continued inward. They were approaching the asteroid belt when every single ship in the Coalition fleet simultaneously received a broadband transmission on every frequency at once. It was a human voice, deep and measured and utterly calm. "This is General Idris Okonkwo of the Terran Continuity Council, speaking to all vessels currently entering sovereign Terran space with hostile intent." Solvan's smile flickered. "You have 60 seconds to power down your weapon systems and reverse course," Okonkwo continued. "This is your only warning, and I strongly suggest you take it." The bridge of the Eternal Certainty was silent for a moment, and then Solvan made a sound that in the Urthai language was the equivalent of a dismissive laugh. "Continue the advance," he said. "They are bluffing. They have nothing here." The 60 seconds expired. The universe changed. It began with the darkness coming alive. The empty space around the Coalition fleet, the void that their sensors had sworn was vacant and safe, suddenly erupted with light as thousands of objects decloaked simultaneously, appearing out of nothing like stars being born. And they were not warships, but something worse. Automated weapons platforms, each one small enough to be invisible to Concord sensors, but carrying enough directed energy firepower to gut a heavy cruiser. They had been there the entire time, waiting. Planets themselves betrayed Solvan's fleet. From behind Jupiter and Saturn and Neptune, where they had been running completely silent, with every system powered down to absolute zero emission, the Terran Continuity Armada emerged, hundreds of warships that looked nothing like the elegant vessels of the Concorde. These were brutal and angular, and covered in layered armor, and bristling with weapons that the Coalition's computers could not even identify. And they moved with a coordinated precision that spoke of thousands of years of preparation for exactly this moment. Solvan stared at the display, and for the first time in his very long life, he felt something that the Ortai had bred out of their species millennia ago. He felt afraid. "All ships open fire," he screamed. The Coalition fleet fired everything they had. It did not matter. The human weapons platforms moved with a speed that the Concorde's targeting systems could not track, weaving between the larger ships and striking with surgical precision. And their weapons were things that the galaxy had never seen before. Gravitational lensing arrays activated, and the fabric of space itself bent around Coalition warships, crushing their hulls inward as if a giant invisible fist was squeezing them. Not enough to destroy them, but enough to buckle armor plating and disable weapon systems, and make every crew member aboard feel the sickening sensation of physics being used as a weapon. Self-replicating electronic warfare swarms poured into the Coalition's communication networks, tiny programs that multiplied and evolved faster than any firewall could contain them, hijacking navigation systems and targeting computers, and turning the fleet's own technology against itself. And ship after ship went dark as their systems were consumed from the inside. Kinetic impactors launched from railgun platforms hidden across the entire solar system struck the Coalition's largest vessels at speeds approaching a significant fraction of the speed of light. And the impacts released enough energy to shatter the main weapons arrays of the dreadnoughts without penetrating their hulls, leaving the ships alive but toothless. And then came the most terrifying weapon of all. The human electronic warfare ships turned their broadcast arrays on the Coalition fleet and pumped a signal directly into every personal communication device on every ship. And what came through was not a threat, and not a demand, and not static. It was music. A human choir, hundreds of voices woven together in a harmony so beautiful and so devastating that it bypassed every mental defense that every species had ever developed. And the melody carried emotions that the alien crew members had no resistance to. Sorrow and compassion and a fierce burning love for life itself that hit the Valkyrie like a psychic bomb. And the Valkyrie crew members across the Coalition fleet collapsed where they stood, overwhelmed by an empathic shockwave they had no capacity to block. The Kethri froze in their positions, as their hive-mind instincts interpreted the music as a signal from a vastly superior colony queen, and their bodies locked up in automatic submission. Even the Urthai hesitated. Even Solvan himself felt his hands trembling on the command console, as something ancient and buried stirred in whatever passed for his soul. The battle lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, not a single Coalition ship had been destroyed. Every single one of them floated dead in space, systems disabled, weapons offline, engines dark. 4,000 warships reduced to drifting metal in less time than it took most species to eat a meal, and the crews inside them were alive and unharmed, staring at their darkened displays in a silence that was heavier than the vacuum outside. Not one alien had been killed. This was not an accident. Mercy born of weakness. This was a message. General Okonkwo's voice came through every frequency in the galaxy, every Concord channel, every civilian broadcast, every deep space relay from the core worlds to the outer rim, and every sentient being in known space heard him speak. "We came to you in peace," he said. "We extended our hand in friendship. We showed you our history and our hearts and our hope that we could walk among the stars together as equals. And you answered us with 4,000 warships pointed at our home." He paused. "And still we chose mercy. And let this be the last lesson the galaxy ever needs about who and what humanity is." On Helix Prime, the Grand Assembly watched the battle footage in a silence that no one dared to break. The eliminationist faction dissolved in the span of an hour, as every species that had contributed ships to Salvan's coalition rushed to distance themselves from him. And Salvan himself was arrested by his own guards and led away from the assembly floor in restraints, while the delegates who had secretly supported him looked at their feet and said nothing. The isolationists quietly disbanded 3 days later, when it became obvious that isolation from humanity was not possible, because you cannot build a wall around a species that has already proven it can see through your walls, and disable your defenses, and spare your life while doing it. 6 months later, the Concord of 12 became the Concord of 13. Humanity was formally admitted as a full member in a ceremony that was broadcast across the galaxy, and Captain Lena Vasquez stood at the podium wearing a simple uniform and spoke words of gratitude and hope and partnership that made even the most skeptical delegates feel something warm in their chests. And if anyone noticed that the humans had somehow negotiated terms that gave them equal voting weight despite being the youngest species by 50,000 years, no one mentioned it, because everyone understood that this was not a negotiation between equals. It was an act of grace from a species that could have demanded much more. Kael'Veth found Lena on the observation deck of Helix Prime that evening, standing alone and looking out at the stars with a glass of something amber in her hand. "Was it always going to end this way?" he asked, standing beside her. Lena was quiet for a moment. "We hoped not," she said. "We spent 2,000 years hoping that when we finally reached out, the galaxy would welcome us. And we spent those same 2,000 years preparing for the possibility that it would not. Because hope and preparation are not mutually exclusive." She took a sip of her drink. "That is the most human thing about us," she said. "We hope for the best, and we prepare for the worst, and we refuse to let either one stop us from moving forward." Kael'Veth looked out at the stars beside her and thought about how small and soft and fragile humans appeared, and how that appearance was the greatest lie in the history of the galaxy. "The other species are afraid of you," he said. "I know," Lena replied. "Are you concerned about that?" Lena turned to him, and her eyes were warm and kind, and ancient in a way that should have been impossible for such a young species. "Fear fades," she said. "We have time, and if there is one thing humans are good at, it is making friends out of people who started as enemies. Give us a few hundred years, and they will wonder how the galaxy ever got along without us." Kael'Veth believed her. On every world, in every system, in every corner of the galaxy, the story of first contact was being told and retold in 1,000 languages, and the details changed depending on who was telling it. Some told it with awe, and some with fear, and some with grudging respect, and some with wonder. But in every version of the story, there was one truth that no one could deny and no one could escape. The galaxy was no longer theirs alone. The newcomers had arrived, and they were kind, and they were terrible, and they were creative, and they were violent, and they were compassionate, and they were relentless, and they carried within them a fire that had been lit on a death world under a small yellow star, and had never gone out, despite everything the universe had thrown at it. And the most frightening thing about them, the thing that made the entire galaxy tremble in a way it had never trembled before, was not their weapons, or their ships, or their terrible swift expansion across the stars.